Would you like to know the secret of good, solid Jewish education? Mordechai found it out just after Haman launched his decree against the Jewish people. We're familiar with the Medrash. The Rebbe is going to give us a magnificent insight into what this Medrash teaches us about Chinuch. So the Medrash Esther Rabbi tells us, as nachdem wir sein Lechtem geworden Hamans Igris, mit Xerifiden und Sonne biad Haman, once Haman had the signed and sealed decrees against the Jewish people in hand, seinen Haman mit Kol bnei Chaberosse gegangen zufriedenheit. So Haman and his crew went out very happy, as you can imagine, und haben begegnet Mordechai, and they bumped into Mordechai. So Mordechai had demol gesehen at the time that Mordechai bumps into Haman or Haman bumps into Mordechai. Mordechai saw shloisha tinokish aboim beisa. Sefer, he noticed 3 children coming out of school. So therefore he says noch gelaufen. So he followed them. Und Haman mit seinen Chabure seinen ihm noch gegangen, bichdei zu hören, was Mordechai wird zerfragen. So Haman and his crew were pretty curious. What's Mordechai going to ask these children? So they followed along as well. So the Medrash continues that once Mordechai reached these children, he asked one of them, tell me which pasuk in Tanakh you learned today in school. It's one of the things the Rambam speaks about, the Gemara speaks about. It's a way to be able to get a sense of what kind of energy there is around a particular event or particular time. So the child said to him, what I learned today is don't be afraid of sudden fear, nor the destruction that is intended by our enemies. The second child heard that, so he explained. He says, today I learned Tanakh. And it was this particular pasuk that we reached when we got up to leave the school. What's the pasuk? They contrive plans, but they'll be cancelled by Hashem. They'll say things and they won't come to fruition. Keep monokel because the Eibush is with us. Then the third child then responded that what I learned is until I am old, Hashem will be with me. And Hashem will sustain me even into very advanced years. The Eibush says, I made you, and I will carry you, and I will help you to sustain and to escape those who try to harm you. So Mordechai hears this. When Mordechai heard these responses, he immediately became joyous, and he was in a tremendously elated spirit. So Haman says, what are you so excited about? What are you so happy about because of what you heard from these children? So Omar, he said, because I just heard good news from them. They gave me good news, which is, I don't have to be at all afraid from the bad counsel that you hatched against us. We're good. So immediately Haman was seething and he declared, my first targets will be these children in the schools. Okay, let's unpack and analyze the story. The time of Pashas, Mordechai hat sich gefreut. Herendik die Psukim von the Kinder. The simplest reason why Mordechai was happy to have heard what the children had to say is, because he saw within their words that there was some level of prophecy, and there's a whole debate between the Rishonim exactly how much prophecy there could be in such a pasuk. But the fact is, he knew this is the Eibush telling him, you don't have to be afraid of what Haman is threatening. In fact, this concept of asking a child what you've learned in school and using that as a compass for how things are going to go is enumerated multiple times in the Gemara. As the pasuk is that the pasuk that the child shares with us is a miniature version of prophetic wisdom that's coming from the Eibush. Okay, so that's why Mordechai is happy, if we're going to take the story at face value. However, we're not going to take it at face value. That explanation is valid, but it doesn't give us the full picture of our story. If the Medrash just wanted to give us that information, Mordechai was afraid because Haman had made these decrees. Then he met the children, they gave him sukkim, which reassured him. If that's the message, then why do we have to have all of the details of exactly what happened in the story? Why do we know that the place where Mordechai encountered them was coming out of the school? Why do we have to know that there were 3 children to say they were children who gave him positive messages? Why do we have to know that they said 3 different psukim? The Medrash could have summarized it to say Mordechai encountered children who gave him psukim that reassured him that everything's going to be fine. Now, as under Protei HaSipur, of course, there are certain details to the story which we had to know. So, for example, it's important for us to know that Mordechai didn't go looking for the children. They, so to speak, happened to be there when he needed children to inquire about what they had learned. And to know that it was more than one child who had given him a positive message is actually valuable to the story, because we know that it's obviously a message that had been reinforced. So that obviously speaks to the lesson of the story and the prophecy of the story. But doesn't sound like we needed to know where this meeting happened, that they were coming out of school. And it doesn't seem that it's relevant to the story to know specifically that there were 3 students, if all we need to know is that he got a reassuring message. Now, as we well know, every single thing in Torah is absolutely precise, which means the language that is used in the way the story is told is relevant to the message of the story, and the order in which the story is told is relevant to the story, in which case there are some anomalies in the story because, for example, the words are different between how the description of each of the 3 children is given, and the order in which their psukim are quoted is not the order of how they appear in Tanakh, so we have to wonder why that is. We have to understand. Aleph, the order in which these children are recorded as giving these psukim, which is Altira, then Rutza'etz, and then Bad Zikna, is not in the correct chronological order that they appear in the Tanakh. Because the psukim Rutza'etzon ve'ad Zikna shtein Sefer Yeshaya. 2 of the psukim come from the book of Yeshaya. Was is V'seder Asfarim Far Mishlei, which is earlier in Tanakh than Mishlei, which is where the 3rd pasuk comes from, Altira. V'shteite pasuk Altira. So the Pashas to say that we can anticipate that the way children learned in school was that they learned Tanakh chronologically, and therefore it's odd that they would present these psukim not in the correct order. In fact, it's not even reverse order. Because if it was reverse order, then we would have used the later pasuk in Yeshaya, which is Ve'ad Zikna, before we got to the earlier pasuk in Yeshaya, Utzeitza. So it's not the regular chronology and it's not a reverse chronology. So what is the meaning of the order in which these pasukim are presented? Also, Beis, this is interesting because when the first child shares what he's learned in school that day, there's no introduction. He just says, this is the pasuk. Whereas the second child has a whole preamble. First he tells us, I learned today. Then he says, and this was the pasuk that we were holding at when I left school. Why is that important? Which implies that he had learned various psukim from Tanakh, but this was the most recent. Isn't he moving? So the fact that the second child tells us, I learned many psukim, does that perhaps imply that the first child only learned one pasuk, the one that he shared with us, Altira? That's a strange suggestion, right? And lastly, Gimel, if it's true, as the Mefarshim point out, that Mordechai saw this as some level of prophetic message, why doesn't he say so? Why does he call it the good news that was shared with me, instead of just saying they prophesied that there's going to be a positive outcome? So those are questions on the details of the story, and then there is a broader question about how the story unfolds. We have to understand. Let's understand when this happened and what happened next. Because Mordechai's simcha seems to dissipate very quickly. The way the Medrash tells us the story, this encounter between Mordechai and Haman, and then Mordechai and the children, happens immediately after Haman signs his decrees into law. And the way the Medrash tells us, that Mordechai is elated because he's got good news, so he's in a state of simcha. And the reason he's besimcha is because there's nothing to worry about. So if that's true, so how come after that does Mordechai seem to lose his simcha, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he goes to the streets crying bitterly, and then all the various things that Mordechai himself did and that he instructed Esther to do, to fast, to gather everybody together, to daven, which is all clearly described in the Megillah. Von dem allem ist Mashma, which all implies as Mordechai den Pot psekli psukecha von den Tinokas nicht angenommen als eine Vur Mamish. So that indicates that maybe Mordechai did not take the words of these children as absolute, as if it were a prophecy, because he clearly still has some concerns. So if that's the case, then why is he besimcha? It seems to be self-contradictory. Either you are besimcha because you know this is good news, in which case you don't have to mourn and gather everybody and fast, or you don't believe that it's absolute, so then why are you besimcha? In order to understand that, we've got to understand what exactly did Haman want to achieve. We know in the words of the Megillah that Haman's intention was, God forbid, to eradicate the entire Jewish people, men, women, and children. But what we're going to examine is why. What motivated Haman to want to kill everybody, children included? So there are two possibilities. Aleph itself in the Megillah, there's what the Megillah says overtly, on base of Midrash Chazal, and then secondly, we have to consider information that is shared with us by the Midrashim. So in the Megillah itself, the Megillah tells us that the reason Haman got so riled up is because all of the servants of the king were bowing to Haman as mandated by the king, whereas Mordechai outrightly refused to bow to Haman, and therefore by Haman got really angry, and then he expanded his anger by it was, so to speak, objectionable to him that he would only attack Mordechai, seeing that he was told Mordechai is one of the Jews, and therefore therefore he wanted to kill everybody. Das heißt, in other words, when Haman did his homework to work out why is it that Mordechai refuses to bow to me, und hat ausgefunden, dass nicht zu dem Mordechai eingeschaffen als Prat. And he determined that it's not because of who Mordechai is and the position that he has, and it's beneath his dignity, Zaynik von the Rosh Sanhedrin, and the Manik by Eden because he's a hot shot in the Sanhedrin and he's the Jewish spiritual leader, so that's why he's not bowing to me. Instead, Haman discovered that no, he discovered that it's because of which nation Mordechai belongs to, the nation called Yehudim, which is the definition of somebody who rejects Avodah Zarah and therefore accepts and commits himself to Hashem. So that basically tells Haman the reason Mordechai is not bowing to you is because he only believes in Hashem. And his kofar b'chol avodah zarah rejects any form of idolatry, including bowing to a human. Certainly anything that considers itself to be an independent entity that has power and say, like Haman did, that really set Haman off, and he was incredibly angry, wanting to kill everybody. And the fact that Haman realizes the reason Mordechai is not bowing is defar valhu Yehudi is because he's Jewish, not because of his personal position. Then is so then he felt that it would be a waste just to attack Mordechai. Haman is smart enough to realize that the reason that Mordechai is not bowing to him is because there is this essential Jew that lives within every single Jew, regardless of age, stage, level of observance, etc., that prompts a Jew to reject idolatry. So therefore, so therefore, it's basically saying Mordechai is just a representation of the fact that the entire Jewish nation rejects Haman's position and his persona. Obviously, they're not going to bow to him. So therefore, he wanted to destroy everybody. So that is the explanation of why Haman had this decree, according to what is stated clearly in the Megillah. The question is, that's what Haman wanted. But we have to ask, what gave him the power? So what if he wanted it? He's a rogue. What gave him the power to actually launch the decree against the Jewish people? So how is it possible that Haman should be able to threaten the Jews in such a terrible way? So the Gemara Megillah tells us that the Jews made themselves vulnerable. They exposed themselves to Haman's power because they bowed to idols. Because the Jewish people had done an action of bowing to idols, even if they didn't really mean it, and it was just purely a show because they wanted to placate the authorities or whatever. But still, bowing to an idol is contrary to the core of what it is to be Jewish. which therefore damages the core relationship that a Jewish person has with Hashem. That's exposed the Jewish people in the greatest way possible, that they could chas v'shalom be threatened totally, because the whole basis for the existence of the Jewish people is our connection to Hashem. So therefore, if the Jewish people, God forbid, reject that connection, they expose themselves, God forbid, not to survive. And that's why Mordechai is afraid. That's why he puts on sackcloth and ashes. That's why he's crying bitterly. Because Mordechai knows everything that's going on, not only in the story, but behind the scenes of the story. He understood why the Eibishter allowed this particular decree to manifest. Therefore, he's given Ta'agosoi. Therefore, Mordechai is anxious. Yes, of course, the Jewish people will claim that they only bowed to the idol because they had to do it to satisfy the authorities. But maybe there was a little bit of genuine feeling for the Avodah Zarah. And even if there wasn't, and it was purely a show, it was completely external and superficial to them. But a person who is willing, even externally, superficially, for the cameras, willing to bow down to an idol, is indicating that my neshama is not speaking to me. Because if my neshama was in my conscious mind, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, any person has that consciousness of their own neshama's sensitivities wouldn't touch a negative thing, certainly not Avodah Zarah, with a barge pole. Und bei sei wollte gewählen im sein Nafsha afilu shloi lasse is rach yezem meisel var neged dem Hashem ki goy nishtachim Avodah Zarah avshe einu mamin bo klal beliboy. And again, as the Alter Rebbe says, the person who has that level of consciousness would absolutely not bow down to an idol, even if it's completely just for show. So the fact that they were willing to bow to the idol with whatever rationalization that they had is an indicator that the neshama is not speaking to them as loudly as it should. Warum? Because the core drive of a Jewish person is to want to have a relationship, a connection to Hashem, and therefore therefore, as Alter Rebbe says, the person is absolutely petrified to even touch the fringe of Avodah Zarah, which would of course be a contradiction to our fundamental belief in Hashem. We don't want to touch it even in the most external way, even if it's just the so-called levushim, even if it's just the thought and speech, without really putting our hearts into it. This is Mordechai's concern. The Rebbe on Mordechai gewusst. As the Weg zu Bitel Agzera is durch mehr sein bei ihnen in Kudus Hayadus as is all coming begolling. So Mordechai knows that the way we have to reverse things is you've got to get back to the source. If the reason the Jews are exposed is because of a lack of connection to their essence and their faith in Hashem, then we've got to regenerate a conscious connection to their faith in Hashem and their absolute willingness to commit to Hashem at all costs. As what Haman knows about the Jewish people, which is that fundamentally the Jewish people will not bow to idolatry. So Mordechai's got to find a system to activate within every single Jewish person that consciousness that they have deep within themselves should become something which is really conscious and translate into how they think, what they say, what they're willing to do, and the fact that they're even willing to sacrifice not to do what is against what Hashem wants. So that's why Mordechai does the fasting and the gathering everybody to daven. But what adds value to what Mordechai is doing is when he hears the children coming out of school, and he hears the psukim in the Meibesh, and he hears that the psukim that they're sharing are psukim of absolute trust and faith in Hashem, which is what he's looking for. That's how, why is he besimcha? Not because the issue is solved, but because he knows the method we need to use in order to solve the issue, which is to get the Jewish people revitalized in their commitment to Hashem, will be successful, because look, Emunah is alive and well in the Jewish people. So therefore, Mordechai is besimcha because he has no fear any longer of Haman's decrees. And it's Dafka after Mordechai hears the good news that he specifically puts on his sackcloth and ashes and cries bitterly through the streets of and he arouses this tremendous sense of mourning between the Jewish people, fasting and crying and eulogizing. Why? It's all technique. What he's doing is he is is activating the Jewish people's capacity to be able to be absolutely dedicated to Hashem, even to the point of sacrifice. Now, if that's what was inspired by these children, if we look at the details of what pasuk each child said and how they said it, will help us to appreciate what Mordechai saw as the faith that was built into the Jewish people, which is in turn a result of successful chinuch. So what's the difference? The pasuk the first pasuk is talking about where the threat is real. It's actually coming. So the first pasuk is saying there is a true threat, ki savoy, there is bad decree coming. Al tira, don't be afraid of it. And the pasuk doesn't tell you why not to be afraid of it. In a pasuk, whereas the second pasuk that says they're going to hatch all their plans and nothing will come of them. That's not describing there's an immediate threat. Rather, it's talking about people behind closed doors coming up with their schemes of how they're going to attack Chas v'Shalom and Jewish people. So in that pasuk we say, don't worry, not only will their plans be neutralized, we say, why? Because the Eibushter is with us. So the first pasuk is talking about a clear and present danger without explaining why you shouldn't fear it. The second pasuk is talking about the incubation of danger, where it says, don't worry, because the Eibushter will take care of it, and it will be neutralized before it even begins. In a different pasuk, the third pasuk is not even talking about danger. It's not describing some kind of a tragedy. Not only is it not an imminent threat, nor is it somebody scheming something against us. Now, it's describing old age. These are natural changes that happen to human beings in the way that the Eibushter created the world. And in response to that, we don't just say the Eibushter will help you through it. The Eibushter will sustain you through the difficult times. But rather, I made you, and I will carry you. It's a very powerful reassurance. So in Teichen Hanyan Beruchnis weisen die drei Psukim auf drei Tnuis und Adreges in dem Eifem von Emunah und Bitochen in dem Eibischen. What's most important for us is to understand the spiritual message behind these three different kinds of Psukim, because they actually describe three different levels and experiences of faith and trust in Hashem. Was bringt heraus die Messias Nefesh von Aiden Vater Eibischen, and it is these three levels of absolute faith and trust in Hashem that precipitate the capacity to actually dedicate ourselves to the point of sacrifice. So the first message is, if you see an immediate threat of the enemies, don't be afraid. I'm not even going to get into why. That describes a person who has faith and trust in the Eibushter. Even though it's completely natural that if there's a sudden unexpected threat, we will be afraid. But that's not how it is when a person has absolute trust and faith in Hashem, even when logically they should be afraid they're not. And nobody has to explain to me why. Because this person is wired in such a way that it is only natural for them to accept that whatever the Eibushter sends our way will be good, and there's nothing to panic about. So that's level one of Emunah. It's built into me, and I know that whatever the Eibushter throws at me, it'll be good. But then there's a more advanced level of Emunah, which is, even if they scheme against me, it's not going to come to fruition. Not only am I not afraid, but I'm absolutely confident that all of their nonsense will amount to nothing. And there's a reason why I'm confident that our enemies will never hatch a decent plan against us, because the Eibushter is with us. And then an even more advanced level of trust and faith in Hashem is that I don't even have to worry about things that are not negative, that are just natural. Even things that are part and parcel of the natural experience of humans. Things that the Eibushter decided are going to be the systems of creation. They might be the natural process, but they don't control me, and I don't have to be afraid of them. And that does need some level of explanation, not just not as Imonukel that the Eibushter is with us, no as the fact that the Eibushter made us and therefore he's going to carry us. In other words, I have to have absolute faith that the Eibushter didn't create me to suffer. So those are the drei madreges in meinem Yisai in dem Chinuch beweis a Sefer von Tinoker shel Beis Rabban. So now these three psukim, which illustrate three different levels of faith or depths of faith, they also illustrate three different success levels of Chinuch. The first child, who is a child right at the beginning of his educational journey, is das in Eifen from Psukecha. He's got one pasuk in his arsenal. Mehr von dem hat gelernt. He doesn't know more than that single pasuk. He has one principle that he lives with because he's just starting his educational journey. So even though this child isn't yet fully developed in his intellectual appreciation of Torah, a child, the first thing that a child has to learn in true chinuch is not to be afraid of the world, not to be afraid of threats. When that then that child progresses and he starts to learn more, like the second child says, I read many psukim today, so this is a more advanced child. But this is the one I concluded with. So he's already learning independently. He already starts to understand Torah independently. Then we teach him that, you know what? Faith and trust in Hashem goes deeper. The absolute certainty which comes from real chinuch, to appreciate that you don't have to worry until the threat is imminent and then trust that the Eibishter will take care of it, but you can be confident that the Eibishter will neutralize the threat before it even manifests, and you know why? Und im dritten Sug Tinnek, was ist noch mehr ist gewachsen in Seichel und das, and then the third child, who's the most advanced of the three, im Land, wenn pflanzt dein ich dem Obleger Said, werden die Spoiler 5 in der Gebolis von Chuki Hateva, that child we can already explain, you know what, you don't only have to be confident that the Eibishter will take care of your problems, but you don't even have to worry about the physical, natural processes of this world. Was der Eibishter hat beschaffen, even though the Eibishter created those systems, mit der ganze Asbara was im Pasuk, and then, of course, the Pasuk goes into explaining detailed why that is and why you don't have to be afraid. So Mordechai is impressed by this. There's decent chinuch happening. There's very healthy chinuch happening in the Jewish community, and therefore the emunah and bitachon will be wholesome, and therefore we'll be able to destroy Haman. But there's something else about the story that's very relevant, and that's where he meets them. As the Medrash describes, Mordechai hears this from the kids as they're coming out of school. He realizes that they have education which doesn't only keep them in the right headspace when they are surrounded by the healthy environment of the school, but rather, der Wegman in Seum and Lenze and Munam says Nefesh Atiru Gomer on sein Obgelegt Ich Beseichel V'Regel. So not only in school do we inculcate a real faith and trust in Hashem, which becomes the way that they think and feel. No, sie nehmen das als mit sich euch, wenn sie seinen Bäume Beis Sefer, but it's so real to them that it is part of them when they leave the school, when they leave that comfort, that cocoon of the school. Kommen zu seiner Heise, when they come to their own homes. Then that made Mordechai tremendously happy. The chinuch is real. It's not just while you're plugged into the source. It's yours. The children own their emunah and bitachon. Von die Psukim, von die Tinoikes, hat gesehen, als bei Eden ist ganz in der Kudus, ja, das bei alle Eden. So what these Psukim from these children convinced Mordechai of was that the essence of Judaism and absolute commitment to Hashem was alive and well in every single Jewish person. Therefore, even though there might be some people who are not yet conscious of it and not yet living with that reality, it's okay. The children who have this very strong grounding in faith will inspire their parents and their family members when they get home. And das sagt der Dir Kaloschen von Mordechai, as I simcha is von der Besuch Tevische Bisruni. And that's why Mordechai says, what's giving him simcha? Good news. That Haman, I don't have to worry about what it is that you're threatening us with. The words of these children is the good news that Mordechai gets. As bei ihnen ist ganz und wird sein ganz in a kudus hayadus am sirs nefesh was is mevatel gezerah Haman. What's the good news? Not a prophecy that Haman will fail, but good news that the Jewish community is hale and healthy and has this proper connection and meaningful connection to Hashem, and therefore Haman will fail. And I don't have to be afraid. Which explains why Haman's anger is now directed at these children. Because in the Tinoikas because he recognized that, number one, the children guarantee that future generations will also reject him and his idolatrous interests. And they are pretty much the reason why the Jews are not bowing now. Not bowing to him, not bowing to any Avodah Zarah, and he hates it and he wants to destroy it. With this information, we can add another layer of appreciation to what the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, that at the time of Purim, the Jewish people ratified what they had committed to at Har Sinai. They now upheld what they had previously committed to. And the great argument/excuse that people could have had why they didn't really have to fulfill Judaism because the Eibishter suspended a mountain over our heads at Har Sinai was now neutralized by the fact that the Jews were committed of their own accord. Because they rededicated themselves to Torah mitzvahs at the time of Achashverosh. Chassidus explains the word heichelu, what they began to do previously, they now established. Chassidus makes clear that at the time of Matan Torah was only the beginning of the process of Jews committing themselves to their Judaism. Because the Jewish people making their absolute commitment to the level of Mesiras Nefesh, Nasa B'nishma, will do whatever you say, we don't even have to work it out, which is a form of sacrifice, was the result of the Eibishter overwhelming them with his incredible revelation and love, represented by the mountain that's suspended over their heads. Purim is given by Chassidus tells us during the time of Purim where there was no lights and sound, there was no great expectations from Hashem. We were living in a very dark time, and yet we committed ourselves to Judaism, so that's real. It's a time where the entire Jewish nation were willing to sacrifice their lives for Hashem, and it was self-motivated. Chassidus says that's what cemented in the commitment to Torah that it started at Har Sinai. So that's something we already know, and now we're going to add a layer to it in context of chinuch. As geschehen in dem Zman von der Chelek bei Matan Torah is dafke beschus der Reves von den Kinder. What happened at the time of Matan Torah? On what basis, as the Gemara Shabbos tells us, did Hashem agree to give us the Torah? The guarantee of our children. B'neinu orvei ma'isanu. Our children will guarantee us. Ot dan the Eibishter gave the Torah to Eden. It was on that basis that the Eibishter gave the Torah to Eden, because there would be obviously continuity having children. So the same kind of thing happens by the Jewish people committing themselves and renewing their commitment and solidifying their commitment to Hashem at the time of Achashverosh. Who did it all hinge on? Also the children. Through these children that we've just read about, who came out of school with this clear message of absolute faith and trust in Hashem, as well as the 22,000 young children that we famously know Mordechai gathered together to daven, and to learn, and to instill within them the capacity for true Mesiras Nefesh. Not only was it potential Mesiras Nefesh, but they were actually there ready to have Mesiras Nefesh. So in the same way as Purim compared to Matan Torah has an advantage, which is that the willingness to sacrifice for Hashem at the time of Matan Torah was a theoretical potential because of the power of the neshama and because of the great revelation of godliness. Whereas at the time of Purim it came to Tachlis, they were actually putting their lives on the line for a complete year of dedication to Judaism with a sword hanging over their heads. Was motivated by their own physical realities. So the same kind of principle applies to how the children become the guarantors of the future of Judaism. As Purim is not like a Matan Torah where the children were the guarantors because the parents verbally committed them to be so, but rather here, he has the children actually illustrating we are dedicated. Not only are we dedicated, but we're going to inspire the adults to be dedicated as well. And that's why it's specifically at that point in time that Judaism is now consolidated properly, and what began at Matan Torah is absolutely complete. So from them, this gives us an incredible lesson for all times, particularly the generation before Mashiach, when, as the Gemara in Megillah tells us, we are still under the dominion of Achashverosh, or the Achashveroshes of our times. If we want to take the temperature of the Jewish community, what's the litmus test of its future? The test is, where are children holding in their beliefs and perspectives? Not just to see what they're being taught at school, but much more importantly, what are they bringing home that is real to them? In other words, simply and clearly, the type of education we give children has to be that from the very youngest formative years of their introduction into education, Long before they can really have a developed intellectual appreciation of Torah. The first thing we have to instill clearly in the minds of every single Jewish child is not to be afraid of anything or anyone. Only the Eibishter. Aber der Vater von Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Eliezer, hat angesagt dem Baal Shem Tov, wenn ist alt gewesen 5 Jahre, as we know, the Baal Shem Tov's father told him when he was just a 5-year-old child, soll's für keinem und für keine Sache auf der Welt nicht mehr haben. Don't be afraid of anything in this world or any person. Men nicht für Gott allein except for the Eibishter. Und wenn sie werden älter. So that's the foundation of Judaism. And then as they grow older and develop, und seinen Scheich zu verstehen, they mature to be able to understand, lernen wir sie auch dem zweiten Union. Then we teach them the next level, which is to verstehen, also to say, we don't even have to worry about the threat of our enemies, because the Eibishter is with us and will neutralize their plans. Und dann nach den dritten Union can now be practiced, and then eventually we graduate them to understanding that you don't even have to worry about natural processes, because the Eibishter is with us. Was geht das? Das soll sich bei sie ablegen, ki der Boy, es soll werden Psukecha. So in order to ensure that this is not just information that they can Google, but rather it is theirs, it's their pasuk, it's their motto, is it maspik lernen bloß die psukim in Torah shebechsav. We're not going to be able to instill this just simply by learning the psukim of Tanakh with him. Now, mit darf sie lernen masbes an kudus al kol ponim for the bi'olim in Torah shebal peh bechlal. What we also have to add to their educational diet is at least some elements of Torah shebal peh. And particularly, we have to instill in them principles and teachings of Chassidus. When Jewish children take on board and really live with the messages of these psukim, even when they're not in the protected environment of the school, and bring it into their homes. Just as it worked miracles back then, it will neutralize our enemies now too. It will guarantee the sustainability of Torah amongst the Jewish people. And we'll have no reason to fear anything in the world. Because as David HaMelech promises us in Tehillim, from the words of Torah, from little children, that totally neutralizes our enemies. Und es wird mekuyim the beheshiv lev albanim and then we'll see the fulfillment of the pasuk, which is that children will restore their parents' hearts to commitment to Hashem. Then which that pasuk is preceded by Hashem's promise that He's going to send us at the Navi. As Rashi points out, that He will tell the children in a very loving way, go speak to your parents, inspire them to follow the ways of Hashem. And as the pasuk continues, that will be at the time of the great and awesome day, Mismach Geula li Geula. We should go from the celebration of the Geula of Purim to the Geula of Mashiach. We should see the day of true Geula with Mashiach immediately.